Recording in progress. Got it. So we're going to start, and I'm going to turn this over to our leader, the if not the oldest, at least the wisest, Paul Douglas.
I will promptly disclaim any relationship to either of Jim's accusation, age or wisdom, either one. Welcome to Zoom meeting number 12. We have met for a total of 12 meetings on Zoom. So it gives a little perspective about the impact of the COVID and upon ourselves, and particularly our age group and its vulnerability. So here we are again. Well, I'm on that subject, I guess, after welcoming you back. Thanks particularly for joining us this fourth Saturday instead of the third, which has been our normal, and for continuing to meet on Zoom. Next month, we will continue with Zoom, and through the rest of the year, actually, there's only 2 meetings left after this, October and November. And we're back to a third Saturday schedule for those last 2 meetings. Unfortunately, we've chosen to be extremely conservative with our judgment on meeting, and we would rather be safe than have to admit our sorrow if someone were to become exposed. So we thank you again for hanging in there to the schedule changes and so on. World War II continues to be fascinating, and we continue to enjoy that as Jim wraps it up. Jim, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Paul. Well, thank you, Paul, and good morning, everybody. As we get into 1944-45, and we'll be approaching the climactic weeks and months of the Second World War. You'll remember, and I'll go through this first part rather quickly, we were talking about the Yalta Conference, February 1945, the last time that the big three would meet. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And I thought this was a pretty evocative piece of art. It's amazing, by the way, how many pieces of art and mugs and quiche and paintings you can find that depict the big three to this very day. And I was reminded of that recently, how much the Second World War is still with us, by a cartoon I saw, which reminded me that symbols, photographs, posters from the Second World War are still very relevant today. Again, showing us that the Second World War, the most catastrophic event of the 20th century, is still with us. We've all, of course, noted with great regret and horror the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan as they are now increasingly being told they can't go to school, or in some limited cases they can, but they can't mix with men, so forth and so on. And I saw this poster or this cartoon, political editorial cartoon. I thought, isn't that interesting? One, very poignant, showing what's occurring to women now in Afghanistan, but also the cartoonist used a universally recognized poster from the Second World War to make his point. So I thought I would include that just to remind us of both points. One, the sadness of what is occurring in Afghanistan with women and girls today. And secondly, reminding us of the continuing impact of the Second World War. Remember, we were talking about the conference in the Crimea, now known as the Yalta Conference. Big Three agree on final joint blows, says the Boston Herald on February the 8th. Europe's military, political, economic problems studied. And I'm going to make a couple of points and then move on to this part of the front page. Yanks burst Siegfried line again. Nazis cry fight for city now on. Rail link blasted. It might help, by the way, Paul, if I got my notes. I can probably do this from memory, but yeah, you get.
It's a crutch.
It's a crutch. It's a crutch. Paul says it's a crutch. He's probably right. Okay. You'll notice, of course, that's Molotov, foreign minister for Stalin. And Stalin, he's obviously talking to whom he's talking. That's Averell Harriman in the middle. Averell Harriman was then ambassador to the Soviet Union from the United States. He later would be governor of New York and would even be involved, very prominently involved in the early negotiations, the Paris peace talks between the US and South Vietnam and North Vietnam. So he was around for a very long time. And of course, everything ties into everything else. Averell Harriman was also married, or would be married shortly, to Pamela Harriman, who was had been married. Pamela Harriman was beautiful, and she'd been married previously to Randolph Churchill, daughter of or son of Winston Churchill. There'll be a pop quiz and all of this later, but it's everything does tie in. And it was Averell Harriman who made the remark that when it came to Eastern Europe, in particular, when it came to the fate of what would soon be post-war Poland, that Roosevelt, Churchill soon found that their ability to maneuver and negotiate with Stalin was limited. Averell Harriman would look back on Yalta and the clash over Eastern Europe and say, well, events were in the saddle. The Soviet army already occupied Poland by the time they met at Yalta. There had been a pro-Soviet puppet government installed in Warsaw in July of 1944. And as Harriman would later write, it would have taken a great deal more leverage than Roosevelt and Churchill in fact possessed to have ordered the situation fundamentally. So instead, there was a declaration of a liberated Europe that came out of the Yalta Conference, a pledge for free elections in the nations liberated from the Nazis and from the Japanese, and a focus on assuring broadly representative governments in the former Nazi-occupied territory, none of which, of course, happened. Stalin had no intention of letting there be any freedom of action in Eastern Europe. This is pointed out, Admiral Leahy pointed this out to FDR after the conference, and FDR replied, "I know, Bill, but it's Bill Leahy. I know, Bill, but it's the best I can do for Poland at this time." In reality, Poland, and you see this News Chronicle, a headline, Big Three complete their plans. And one of them you see is a new government in Poland, how control of the Reich, how it's going to be divided up during the occupation after victory, final plans for winning the war, for resettling Europe. Poland, where again, the war began when Germany invaded Poland September 1st, 1939, would in fact be the test case. There'd be the precedent for all the post-war Soviet satellite nations of Europe, and would become symbolic and very much part of what would soon be the Cold War. FDR also told Cardinal Spellman, I don't know if I mentioned this last time or not, the Catholic Cardinal in New York, that he told him privately, the European people will simply have to endure Soviet domination, and will be divided into spheres of influence. Harsh reality. Many can argue whether or not we should have done more or could have done more to rein in Stalin, but he was on the gates of Germany, Berlin practically, and he was in no mood for any negotiating. 1945 cartoon. You see the kind of the cynical attitude that was already present. Britain, US, and Russia carving up Poland, reassembling Poland, and now you have this kind of Frankenstein monster with the foot where the head should be, and free, strong, independent Poland. Again, a biting political cartoon of the time, but one that reflected the views of so many people. I think I may have mentioned, so I won't spend much time on it, that Churchill was maybe much more troubled than Stalin by what he saw as what he would soon describe. He coined the phrase in 1946, the Iron Curtain that was descending upon Eastern Europe. And he met personally with Stalin on the issue, trying to at least carve out percentages in the post-war Eastern European governments. He had the idea, if we cannot have free elections, let's at least privately agree on coalition governments. They will include communist and non-communist elements. He made the effort. I think Winston gets some credit for that, but of course it was not to be. And this is Churchill leaving the meeting with Stalin. Again, pragmatically, I guess, facing up to the fact that there were Soviet boots in the ground and there wasn't too much you could do about it. Stalin and FDR, subsequent to the Churchill visit, met privately. It's not unusual to have the big three meet in separate meetings. They didn't always meet all three of them together. And this wasn't a secret meeting, but it was a meeting just between Roosevelt and Stalin and their interpreters. And this is the meeting where FDR got his #1 goal at Yalta accepted, which was the commitment from Stalin that he would move to declare war on Japan. Remember, beginning in 1945, Japan and the Soviet Union were not at war. It had not been throughout the World War. And Stalin agreed that he would, within 2 or 3 months, he would, after Germany's surrender, which they all hoped would be imminent, that he would declare war on Japan. And again, FDR very concerned to get Soviet support, as he was being told by his generals and admirals that in the Pacific theater, the war with Japan could easily last through all of 1945 and probably all of 1946. The last thing he wanted. In return, FDR made several concessions to Stalin in return for his commitment involving war against Japan. I won't go into the details except to say they involved the return of the southern portion of the Sakhalin Islands. This is the Sakhalin Islands. This is Japan. This, of course, is China and above Soviet Union. Japan had acquired them in 1904 after the Russo-Japanese War, and Stalin wanted them back, got part of them back. Also, there was an agreement by FDR on it's pronounced Kuril or Kuril, you see both islands, which over here they're here in relation to Japan. One reason we don't have to go into a lot of detail is that the dispute between Japan and what is now Russia over the Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands has never been resolved. Witness this cartoon, Kuril Islands still being contested, who should have dominant influence over the islands, the Japanese or the Russians. This is the rope being pulled by then Prime Minister Abe of Japan and Vladimir Putin of Russia. So that's an issue that was dealt with at Yalta, never resolved, hasn't been resolved to this day. Another interesting case is Mongolia. FDR, again, he was willing to do a lot in return for imminent Soviet entry into the Pacific theater in the war with Japan. He also agreed to recognize Soviet control of outer Mongolia. I can't translate this. If one of you can, feel free to do so, tell us. This looks like a picture of Stalin shaking hands with Mao Zedong. Actually, it really does look like that. In reality, this is one of the many leaders of the puppet government in outer Mongolia that was already a reality. FDR would be heavily criticized, and for many years after FDR was gone, in the 50s and the 60s, beyond, there'd be criticism that FDR agreed to recognize, that the US would recognize what now became the Mongolian People's Republic, independent of China, independent of Russia, supposedly. In reality, everyone knew that, again, Stalin already had troops on the ground in Upper Mongolia, and that what FDR was really doing, for better or worse, was recognizing what was a reality. Hence the Mongolian People's Republic, which would continue to exist until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1993. And why do I spend time on Mongolia mentioning this? It's a very large nation. Even today, it only has about 3 million people, only 3 million people. I mention it because when you think about it, by agreeing to the creation of what was the Mongolian People's Republic, FDR also was recognizing what would become the very first Soviet satellite nation. Before any nation in Eastern Europe, you have Mongolia. So again, it's worth mentioning for that reason. It's also interesting and important for what will become the Cold War after World War II, that FDR made these commitments, which certainly affected China as well as the Soviet Union. And we're talking about nationalist China, without consulting the Chinese, without consulting Chiang Kai-shek, who was not part of the Yalta Conference. But again, FDR made the concession because he thought he was recognizing reality. And he did get an important commitment, which Stalin kept, which was that he would in turn recognize, Soviet Union would recognize nationalist China, Chiang Kai-shek's China, as the real government, the official government, diplomatically recognized by the Soviet Union of China. It became known as, this is FDR and Stalin at Yalta. It became known as the Soon-Stalin Agreement. This agreement would be signed August the 14th, 1945. You know, when you do the math, okay, this is after Hiroshima, after Nagasaki, after the Soviets are already in the war in the Pacific, although they haven't been there very long. You see, this is Molotov on behalf of Stalin, looking on, signing the Soon-Stalin Agreement. Again, why is it significant? The head of the Soviet Empire is recognizing nationalist China, not a communist nation, as the official, Chiang Kai-shek's government as the official government of China. Pretty remarkable. By the way, Molotov, why do we know his name? We know his name for the role that he would play, this is after Stalin's death, in the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, when Hungarians trying to fight back against invading Soviet tanks would put rags into bottles, set them on fire, throw them in Soviet tanks, and they became known as
Molotov cocktail.
Molotov cocktails. Exactly right.
Still used in Detroit, by the way.
Still used in Detroit, Paul points out to me. Again, I'm trying to not to go into the minutia, but why do we care about this Soon? Soon, by the way, was Chiang Kai-shek's brother-in-law. Why do we care about the Soon-Stalin Agreement of August of 45 that came out of discussions between FDR and Stalin at Yalta? We care for this reason. This is Chiang Kai-shek. This is Mao Zedong. Bitter enemies. Mao Zedong had been fighting a revolution against the nationalist government, trying to overthrow it and establish a communist China since, well, really beginning to gather steam 1931 onward. there had been, why do we have a picture of these two men? They had agreed to a temporary armistice during the course of the war against Japan in essentially 41 to 45. But the armistice for the duration of the war is with the understanding they would continue killing each other. The revolution would resume as soon as Japan was defeated. And that's simplistic. In reality, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek did everything they could to undermine each other during the Second World War, even when they were supposedly allies. And in fact, Mao turned out to be much better at it than Chiang Kai-shek and continued to build anti-Japanese guerrilla forces that he easily and rapidly converted into communist guerrilla forces trying to overthrow the government once the Second World War was over. It's also the agreement, Stalin's agreement, is also important because Mao Zedong never forgot it. He never forgot that his supposed ally and leader in the world of international communism, Joseph Stalin himself, signed a diplomatic piece of paper recognizing Chiang Kai-shek, not him, as the post-war government of China. Something that once the Mao came to power in 1949 and Chiang Kai-shek was exiled to Taiwan, it was something that for the rest of his life, Mao Zedong would never forget, that Stalin had what he viewed stabbed him in the back. So Yalta wraps up, and here's a kind of an informal, candid photo of the three. And now I want to turn to what else was going on in the world right before and even in the very beginning of the Yalta Conference. We know what was going on in the Pacific. The war was very much far from an end, it looked like. We know that the island hopping campaign was getting closer and closer. We've talked about Okinawa, talked about the various the strategy of fighting closer and closer to mainland Japan by American forces, American and Allied forces. What was happening in the European theater? And that's where I want to focus a lot of our lecture today. Because when FDR came to Yalta in February, early February of 1945, one of the last great land offensive, the last great ground war was just finishing up in Europe. It was the Battle of the Bulge, which actually began in the Argonne Forest earlier, September, October, November, but the full onslaught by Nazi Germany and what became the Battle of the Bulge really is from December 15th to the end of the year. And in fact, there was still some fighting going on as FDR was leaving for the Yalta Conference. So, the location, just to use a standard map, we're going to be looking at this part of the world in Europe. This is Netherlands, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany. Most of what we're going to be talking about occurs here. This is the Ardennes Forest. You can see its position in terms of Germany and France and Luxembourg. and Bastogne. Bastogne will be the critical center of the battle when all is said and done, because it seemed like all roads in the Ardennes forest, all roads in that part of Belgium led to Bastogne. So Belgium and Luxembourg are where most of the Battle of Bulge occurs. And that will take us to, by the way, as we go through this, the commanders who are, you'll hear me mention them, who are critical. Overall control, of course, the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF as they called it, SHAEF, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And here he is meeting with the three commanders who would play, I guess you might say, the key roles on the Allied side in the Battle of the Bulge. George Patton, who had the Third Army, Omar Nelson Bradley. General Bradley had the 12th Army, and probably the least known of the three today, Courtney Hodges, Hodges, who had the First Army. All three men will play crucial roles in the Battle of the Bulge. This is, by the way, a photograph from March of 1944. So it's a few months before these events occur. And just to orient ourselves, again, Belgium, France, Netherlands, Germany, we talk Luxembourg, talk about the Ardennes Forest, talk about Bastogne, which is where Hitler was heading. This is where it's located. This is a simple map, but I think it's always good to orient yourself. Now here's the map you can't read, but I put it in for a couple of reasons. Battle of the Bulge, again, it would be, this map says it was the 15th of December to the 26th. That is when most of the fighting occurred. The Germans began to retreat actually by New Year's Eve, but again, it would spill over into the beginning of 1945. I put the map in only one to remind you of tremendous, how complex the Battle of the Bulge became. And here, by the way, you can see where the First Army was located initially under Courtney Hodges. Down here, the Third Army under George Patton, and Bastogne, when Patton brings his troops and infantry to relieve Bastogne, he'll be heading north here. The principal German commanders, Dietrich, Manteuffel, Model, and Brandenburger, I will not include them on the pop quiz, but they were Hitler's, again, his primary commanders in the battle. One more, this map is only to, again, orient ourselves. Eisenhower's plan was to drive on a broad front toward the Rhine and toward toward Berlin. And you notice here, this is the Rhine River. You also notice, you'll hear us talk about the Ruhr industrial area, RUHR, is up towards the north. And again, when this orienting you to the commanders, up here is the 21st Army Group under Bernard Montgomery, the British commanding field marshal, who would prove, by the way, during the Battle of the Bulge to be completely insufferable to his fellow commanders. 12th Army Group under Omar Bradley was situated in the middle, north middle. Devers, we won't probably talk about much, the 6th Army, although they played their own key role in the south. And then further south off the map would be George Patton's 3rd Army. Also, you can, oh, I'm sorry, here it is. Further in towards the Rhine, you can see again the Ninth Army under Simpson. Probably won't talk about him. First Army, we will talk about Courtney Hodges' First Army a lot. You can see how close they are to the Rhine. And when they start their big push, they're in the Battle of the Bulge. Third Army coming up from the south under George Patton. Okay, and might mention, by the way, that one of the things where this picture comes from, one of the things in the Ardennes Forest that is so amazing is there was a feeling that the war in Europe is all but over. So right up until the surprise offensive by Nazi Germany into the Ardennes Forest, heading toward, they hoped, Antwerp, and pushing the Allied forces back into the sea, entertainers kept coming to the Ardennes Forest, much to their credit, to entertain. And this is one I thought was especially interesting. This is Marlene Dietrich, who would, of course, have been a famous film actress since The Blue Angel in 1931, I think. Femme Fatale, very, very internationally famous German actress who had fled Germany, was ferociously anti-Nazi, and a great risk to her life, entertained Allied, American, English, Australian troops, Allied troops throughout the Second World War. Here she is in the Ardennes Forest near, in fact, she's in Bastogne with General Patton. You didn't ask, so I won't tell you that they famously also apparently had an affair. But this is Marlene Dietrich, after all. And Marlene Dietrich, what's interesting about this picture is that it was taken in Bastogne, and she did entertain the troops. She did, you know, go to the, meet with them in the hospitals and so forth. And the Battle of the Bulge would begin, unbeknownst to both of these individuals, less than 48 hours later. Okay, I'll come back to Hodges. This is early November, Argonne Forest, American troops, infantry, 1944. The line was lightly defended. Again, you know how close we are to Germany. The advance of the Allied forces into Belgium and Luxembourg, this is lightly defended. Again, these are people on the alert, scouts. There are skirmishes, but not all-out war yet. This is early November. It's November 3rd, 1944, when this picture was taken. And this is the person we're going to talk about. And for that, I will turn to my lovely and able and brilliant producer, Pat. Pat, you want to take it away?
Jim has already shown you this handsome young man. His name is Daniel Ryant. And Danny was the youngest child of Elsie and Frank Ryant. He was born in Chicago in 1924. At 19, he enlisted or was drafted into the Army, April of 1943. And I apologize, my throat is very dry. I'm a genealogist, amateur genealogist, whatever, and I have been attempting to complete Jim's family tree for quite a while. And there you go. With pretty good success. It hasn't been really that difficult. But the story that has intrigued me was the story of this young man, because there was not a lot of detail about what happened to him in World War II. The family story was that he was killed in the Battle of the Bulge. You already know that that's not likely because he was killed in November of 44, and that he was buried someplace in France and was disinterred and brought back to the United States and was buried in Chicago, South Chicago. That's about all we knew. And by the time I started really investigating this in 2008, everyone who knew Danny or had known Danny was no longer with us, except for Bill, his Jim's older brother by 10 years, who was 9 years old when they buried him in the Chicago cemetery. And he doesn't remember a lot about that, but he does remember his Uncle Danny to that point. So when so that's where the quest begins. And I wanted to find out where he served, the circumstances of his death, and where he was buried. Now, remember back in 2008, access to records online was limited. You might find indexes, but with only the basic information. So I had to go to the source or go to your deposit repositories. First thing I did was order Danny's military service records. I sent a request to the National Personnel Records Office in St. Louis, Missouri. No records were found for Daniel Ryant. I was not surprised because back in 1973, there was a fire that destroyed 85% of the Army and the Army Air Force personnel records that were stored there. So of course, the response I got back from the records personnel office was that no records were found. So that's where most of the information would have come from. So now I had to look at in the Illinois records for any clues to Danny's military service. I found one online, not an online source, but at the library, World War II honor list of dead and missing, state of Illinois, Cook County. The only Ryant was a Norman initial D, PFC, died of wounds, DOW. Who the hell was Norman? The next step, and there were several other steps in between, but I won't go into all that detail because it's very laborious. Next was to go to the National Archives and search for his military records. And those records, that took us to the National Archives Annex in College Park, Maryland, where all military records except personnel files since World War II are archived. Now, we've all watched the Ken Burns series and watched the Steven Spielberg movies and marveled at some of the books written about World War II or any conflict, and they're in such detail. Where did this stuff come from? Do they just make it up? You know, the names, the places, the location, the times. No, they don't make all of it up. They might embellish some things. However, they, or most likely their staffs, will spend days, hours, days, months, weeks, even years searching for and reviewing after action reports and military unit records at the annex. Without Danny's personnel records, I would have to recreate his military service through the unit records. It's a relatively new facility, obviously, in College Park. The thing that is interesting when you walk in is that there are rooms off to the side, a lot of rooms that are filled with these library trays full of boxes of documents. And when I asked the person in charge, you know, what was the deal? And he said, well, he said, that room is for Ken Burns, for example, or that room is for whoever is Stephen Ambrose. anyone who's working on a project, they will leave the records that they are working on in the room. They know where they are. So if someone else comes in and asks for them, then they can retrieve them temporarily. But the main thing is that you don't have to start all over again every time you go to work on the records. So that's, I spent an entire day at the National Archives Annex just trying to find out what they had and how to search. And the first thing that I found gave me all the necessary details so that I could find the rest of Danny's records. That is an application for headstone or marker. I went straight to this document and asked for it specifically because I knew that he had been disinterred and had been sent back to Chicago. Well, this tells me everything. He has an enlistment date, the fact that his name in the military records were Ryant Norman Daniel, obviously wrong, and that he was in the 47th Infantry, 9th Division. He died on November 21st of 1944. He was reinterred at the Evergreen Cemetery in Chicago. But what Jim was most excited about is that we knew without doubt that we had the right guy, because the signature at the bottom is Mrs. Elsie Jane Ryant. And she signed this application December 19th, 1947. So this is all I needed to begin the search, because it tells me his unit, the dates involved, and also now I know where he was buried in Chicago. So we'll come to that later. Right now, I'm just interested in getting his service records. So I went through all the indexes and had a list of the documents that I wanted to explore in more depth. Then what they would do is they would find the boxes and save them for me. And I made an appointment for Jim and me to go back to the archives annex about a week later. When we got there, we were greeted with a three-tiered library cart. You've seen them, filled with 11 14 by 10 by 8 inch gray archive boxes, each filled with records from the 9th Division, 47th Infantry Combat Team, which was Danny, down to the company level, Company K. We know he's Company K. And this is an example of the detail that you find. And I'm not, this is just, not expecting you to read it all or whatever, but it does tell the level of detail. Now this is at the 47th Infantry level. It talks about November 16th. We know that Danny's still alive then. And we know that there's the heavy bombing in the vicinity, that they're focusing on this. Excuse me, if I mispronounce these towns, I do. In Grüsenich, Germany, and I was for H8 minutes to H4 minutes, 3 battalions of howitzers, 1 battalion of 8-inch howitzers, 1 brigade of 8-inch howitzers and 240 millimeter howitzers. The 1st Infantry Division with the combat team, they would attack at 12:45 to seize the crossings of the Rohr River north of Durand. And I don't know what these numbers are as far as the in the prints afterward, but after being passed through by the 1st Infantry Division, the 47th Combat Team would attack to seize Grüsenich with 1 battalion, and thereafter to pass through the 16th Infantry Combat Team and seize and hold the line along the railroad. I'm not going to go on from that, but you can see the level of detail. And this is at the 47th Infantry level. I want to really zero in on what was happening in Company K. So here I can tell that they did cut the road leading northeast from Versenich. And I imagine these are map coordinates. Enemy resistance to the day's advance of the 47th Combat Team was moderate. The 1st Battalion was engaged in house-to-house fighting, where approximately 21 prisoners were taken. So that's again the detail. We know that Danny died of wounds on the 21st. So I narrowed the period to just before the 21st, and found out that indeed there was heavy fighting going on to secure Hill 187 and to maintain contact with the 104th Infantry Division, basically to secure the Roar. Now, again, I'm not going to read all this, but this shows you how intense the fighting was, including the fact that they had heavy artillery, heavy existence, extremely heavy fire, advancing through the woods. It's very detailed. Let me move this thing. All roads and trails were perpetually interdicted, and the woods in most places were impenetrable because of the trees felled by bursting shells. Casualties were severe. Supply and evacuation problems, one of the utmost hazards. So it's somewhere in here does have mortar, about the mortar shelling. There you go. Blanketed by prepared artillery and mortar defensive fires. So it's intense. Now, obviously, the only names that we're going to have associated with these battles are going to be the officers, but knowing that Danny was in Company K, and by the way, they would reorder combined units to fill out the holes, basically, of where soldiers had died. So it could be a mixture of several different companies. The other thing I found that again was partial was this again part of this, all these records I found in May of 2010, that Private First Class Ryant Norman D was killed, died of wounds. And so that was kind of not the end of the search, but it completed that part of the search. And the next thing is to find out, what happened from here. Okay, let me do this. See, it's tougher when you're on this side of it. Well, heck, I'm just going to do it this way. You might ask, where do all these records come from? All this minutia, where does it come from? And the answer is, everyone watched MASH, so all about Corporal Radar O'Reilly, the company clerk. Well, the record keeping begins with the company clerk so Company K Company would have been sending up to the next level at the 47th Infantry Regiment, which then it would go in turn to the 9th Infantry Division, which it would all be merged with the other companies, the other units, then on up the chain of command to the First Army. So the after action reports are even more detailed than what I've shown you, because they have combined, or they have reduced it from several companies into one, and just so you get a flavor. So I can actually go down to the company record, company label, and there I would read the actual positioning of, say, 3 of the riflemen from Company K, just that they're going around a building, and they're going into what's supposed to be an empty building, and finding, you know, munitions or whatever. But it tells you down to the minute exactly what happened that day for that particular company. So it's very detailed, and that's how these writers and screen producers, I mean, movie producers can be so precise, and you can be pretty comfortable that they are really the best ones, are really going to this much effort. Quick history of the 47th. The 9th Division saw its first combat in the Northern Invasion in November of 42. Then they went on through to patrol the Spanish-Moroccan border, Tunisia. Then August, Palermo, Sicily. And then they returned to England in November to prepare for the liberation of Europe. Now, this is where Danny would have joined them, because remember, he was enlisted in April of 43. So he has to go through a lot of training before he actually sees any action in Europe. So he joins them in England to prepare for the battle in Normandy. The division hit Utah Beach on the 10th of June. That's D-Day +4. And they drove on to Cherbourg, penetrated the port's heavy defenses, took a brief rest in July, then took part in the St. Lo breakthrough, on to cross the Marne, swept through, I'm not going to pronounce these names right, and moving on into the German campaign. And what we know, we don't know necessarily exactly the spot where he died. We do know that he made it through the Hurtgen, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, forest, and he would have been killed near Bovenberg, I think that's how you pronounce it, at Hill 187 or thereabouts. That was their objective, was Hill 187. He was temporarily interred at Henri Chapelle Cemetery in Belgium, and then he was permanently interred at the Evergreen Cemetery in Evergreen Park, Illinois. So that, unless we want to write a more detailed account of what Ryan was doing, Danny was doing at any point in the war, that tells us enough to know exactly, more or less exactly where he was buried. We did find that out. And the end of the story for me at this point is later that year, in 2010, I was in Chicago on a business trip, and I decided that I was going to find Danny's grave, and I did. And the ironic part is I was going to be late to catch a flight back to DC, and I didn't know exactly where this was. This is pre-GPS, so very, very limited. So I've got the Chicago maps. Ended up going the wrong way down a one-way street. An officer pulled me over, which I'm glad he did. And I told him what I was looking for, and he led me to the Evergreen Cemetery, which is kind of cool. So I go to the office, and they confirm that Danny is there, and that the headstone was correct to show that it was Daniel N. Ryant, and that I'm still in a hurry because I have to catch a plane. So now I've got to find his gravestone. And what it turns out is he was right across the walkway from the office of the cemetery, up on a little hill, which is a hill that they had designated for military personnel. So I mean, it was 50 feet, maybe 100, but I mean, I'm not good at distances, but that's how close he was. And so I got a picture of his grave, and I borrowed a small American flag from a nearby grave. I'm sure they wouldn't mind. And got pictures of Danny's grave and then returned the flag to its rightful owner. But that's the story, a personal story, and of how genealogy and history and the research that we historians and genealogists do to fill out the picture. Back to you, Mr. Spurlock, Professor Spurlock. Shall we take a break now? Okay, we're going to break for 10 minutes. And when in 10 minutes, we'll have our act back together and you'll have Professor Spurlock back. Thank you.
Let's get back to the war itself. I should mention that Hitler had been even more unhinged than normal, if that is possible, since the July 20th bomb plot, when he'd been nearly assassinated by some of his inner circle. We took that, we, the Allies, took that as a sign that the German high command was disintegrating. In fact, some G2 intelligence at Chief Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, some G2 intelligence said the August battles, is the August 44, have done it, and the enemy in the West has had it. So there was, again, a very strong feeling in many quarters among the Americans, the British, other allies, Australians, that the war in Europe was just about done. Hitler's paranoia now knew, especially after he had nearly been assassinated, knew no bounds, and he was already beginning to once again put all the blame for what seemed to be a disaster on the Eastern Front, which had been totally his idea, on everybody but himself. He told his inner circle, now I know why all my great plans in Russia had to fail in recent years. It was all treason. But for those traitors, we would have won long ago. Yes. Okay. We have a question from Ron.
Oh, come on. I want.
Pat, I need to go on unless you can do that. We're breaking up the flow here. On September the 16th of 44, this is when Hitler had astonished his entourage, who were there for another meeting. Commander Alfred Jodl, J-O-D-L, was speaking to the German inner circle, the high command, about the scarcity of heavy weapons, ammunition, scarcity of tanks on the Western Front. And again, September 16th, 44, Hitler interrupted him, and he announced, to the astonishment of most of the people in the room, that he decided that there was going to be a counterattack, and that the counterattack was going to be in the Ardennes Forest. The object would be Antwerp, and he hoped to divide the French and the the English and the American forces, push them back to Antwerp, which was our supply depot for the Western campaign and then push us back into the sea. In effect, undo everything that happened since June 6th of 44. He also, many in the room were very dubious of this idea because they knew how short the Germans were of supplies, of men. They also knew that the Luftwaffe was essentially out of the war, that we now had air supremacy almost everywhere in Europe, we the Allies. But he was interrupted by Hitler and says, no, 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 I have this all figured out. This is going to be another Dunkirk for the Americans and the British. And we're going to launch it during bad weather. And if it's in bad weather, heavy snow, the air advantage, air supremacy that the Americans have will be negated because they won't be able to fly. They'll have poor visibility. Also, by the way, during this very time, September into October of 44, as Hitler was making his plans for what would become the Battle of the Bulge, Field Marshal Montgomery was, as usual, causing problems. He had, Ike called a major conference of his senior commanders for September the 22nd. This would be Omar Bradley. This would be Courtney Hodges. This would be all of them. This would be Teller from the Navy, and so forth and so on. And Montgomery didn't show up for Ike's all hands meeting of his senior commander. He sent an aide instead. And then a week after that, when he ran into General George C. Marshall, who was in Europe visiting, doing a tour of the front, Field Marshal Montgomery cornered him. This was in Eindhoven, criticized Eisenhower's entire wide front strategy for the Western campaign, and he also openly questioned Ike's command abilities. Not surprisingly, General Marshall was livid at what he called Monty's, quote, overwhelming egotism. And here you get to see how Eisenhower would handle Montgomery. He'd do this more than once. He's being openly criticized by really his most senior commander under him, and also widely popular Bernard Montgomery back in Britain, the British public. And now he knows, because Marshall told him, he's being criticized, his abilities, his plans are being criticized by Montgomery to Marshall. And Ike responds in a letter. Again, this is all the eve of the Argonne campaign. And Ike writes Montgomery, quote, if you as the senior commander in this theater are one of the great allies, feel that my conceptions and directives are such as to endanger the success of our operations, it is our duty to refer the matter to a higher authority for any action that they may choose to take, however drastic. In short, you want a piece of me? You want to take me on? Fine, we'll take this to Churchill, we'll take this to Roosevelt, and they can decide who's running the show here. Montgomery immediately backed down, at least for the moment. Now, I mentioned Courtney Hodges, the commanding general of the U.S. First Army, who will play a key role in the Battle of Normandy. He was headquartered at SPA, S-P-A, in Belgium. It was It was the same location, the spot. This was an old resort town. This was the same area that had housed General Paul von Hindenburg and Kaiser Wilhelm II right at the end of the First World War. Now it's the headquarters of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, U.S. First Army. But it wasn't a happy place. Actually, the First Army headquarters under Hodges reeked of resentment and frustration at the slow progress that they were making across Europe, heading toward eventually the Rhine. This is, of course, Hodges on cover of Time magazine, mid-October of 1944. Courtney Hodges is an interesting figure. He was one of those few people who had gone from private to commanding his own army. He'd risen all the way up to the top. He was also think of Patton and think of the opposite. Courtney Hodges is very formal, very clipped. You notice he has a clipped mustache even. At this point, he's 56 years old, always held himself erect. People said he seldom smiled. He was a hard man to get to know well. And by the way, he was a Southerner. He spoke with a Southern accent. He was from Georgia. On the less flattering side, Courtney Hodges also was reluctant, as we'll see in the Battle of the Bulge, to make quick decisions. And his kind of old school philosophy, he was not one for feints, maneuvers, diversionary action. He believed you just go straight, head on at the enemy, which is exactly what he would do in the Argonne Forest. He also was distant, unlike a Patton, unlike a Bradley, certainly, Omar Bradley, unlike Eisenhower. Courtney Hodges hardly ever visited the front. He hardly ever went to paid visits to his divisional commanders in the field. In many ways, he kind of ran his army like a CEO, a businessman, a CEO at headquarters. And he was determined that under Ike's general plan, he was going to drive toward the Rhine, straight through the Ardennes Forest. Remember that the Ardennes Forest, Hürtgen Forest, is the Ardennes region, the Hürtgen Forest, is a semi-mountainous expanse that's mainly deep pine woods with a few patches of oak and beech, occasional areas where there's a little mesa, but primarily it all looks like this. The pine forest was dense. It was seen to be perpetually dark because it was so heavily forested. And also, as we will soon see, the slopes and the ravines in the Hürtgen Forest, where people like Danny Ryant fought, would prove too steep for tanks on both sides, German and American and British. And they were constantly getting stuck in the mud. They were constantly breaking down. It was also the terrain was exhausting for the infantry. Again, infantry on both sides of the war, because again, the terrain was so rough and they were heavily laden with all that they're carrying with them, and slipping and sliding among the mud and the rock and the roots of the heavy vegetation became became a ghastly daily way of life. To the dismay of, one more example. I don't want to burden you with statistics, but one more example. The 9th Division, the division in which my Uncle Danny served. By the way, if you notice, he also, when he was killed in action, he was 19 years old. During this period, November, even into October, the month before, that division is typical of so many others. The 9th Division had already suffered so many casualties, some 4,500 battle and non-battle casualties by middle of October even, that it's estimated that that division gained, had one casualty for every yard they advanced. Imagine that, one casualty for every yard they advanced on average. Again, it seemed that General Hodges took no account of the terrain. He wanted to, many people wanted him to go further south to advance the troops instead of going straight ahead through the Ardennes forest. He would not hear of it. He was, on this, he was inflexible. Of course, you see the weather, you see it was constantly snowing. He also was going through an area, much like Hitler hoped he would, where American advantages in tanks, or especially in air and in artillery, were least effective. Hodges' own headquarters staff, and we now know his corps commanders, most if not all of his corps commanders, didn't think this was the right strategy. But they weren't about to contest the boss when you follow orders. And secondly, Hodges, this is something that came back to haunt him, had a reputation for sacking his senior officers if they disagreed with him. Here's a evocative picture. This is the October. No, this is actually November Ardennes forest. You can see the fingers in the airs, the artillery. They say the sound. Just the sound in the Argonne, in the Birken forest was overwhelming. Hitler continued his plotting for the offensive. He wanted the offensive to begin the 1st of November, but it would get pushed back until December the 15th. This is a picture of him in October. You know, it's Goring, looking over plans for the German drive, the surprise attack, counterattack, if you will, through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, Luxembourg, push him back to Antwerp. When the attack did come, December the 15th, 1944, the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, one of the advantages the Germans had, besides the element of surprise, and they did keep it a surprise, was that the Ardennes region, the Hürtgen forest, was lightly defended. On the day of the attack, December the 15th, there were only 4 divisions, about 80,000 men, Allied men, American and British, some French, who were covering 80 miles north to south, the American advance toward Germany. Think of that, 80,000 men to cover 80 miles. This is a picture that was taken early December of 44, and right on the eve of the attack from Germany, lightly defended line. And again, Germans were relying on stealth and surprise. Again, a map just to kind of give you a feel as the Argonne offensive begins, the Battle of the Bulge. Again, reminder, Montgomery's up in the north, Hodges more in the middle, Patton in the south, the 101st Airborne, by the way, which will play a critical role in relieving Bastogne, comes in this direction, and then again, the German attack. The Germans threw everything into it. By the way, the attack began at 5:30 a.m. When thousands of guns opened up on the American line. I mentioned how lightly defended we were at the moment. Hitler sent in 25 divisions. That's about 250,000 German troops on the attack. Not all of them by any means were in tip-top shape, but by now anyone who could be drafted between the age of 16 and around 60 was being drafted, was in the German army, and many were again well past their prime. Many were infirm. There were actually cases people were taken out of hospitals so they could walk and put into the German divisions. And also Hitler opened up the prisons. Many people who were in the German forces were convicts. He also sent in some 600 tanks for this initial invasion. And here's a better map of the German attack in Siegfried Line, the advance. This is the German advance. And why is it called the Battle of the Bulge, Paul?
So it looks like it's Bulge to the west.
Yeah, German line had been here, roughly Siegfried Line, and here's the Bulge. They had pushed it back, hence the name, the Battle of the Bulge. And right in the middle is Bastogne. There also would be a tremendous fighting in St. Vith, CITH. And I might as well mention that in Malmedy is another infamous site in the Battle of the Bulge, Malmedy. You can see it's here, right in the tip of the Bulge. Malmedy became a rallying cry for Allied forces fighting the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge, because it is here that the numbers vary, but at least 600 American and British prisoners of war had been captured in Malmedy and then had been executed, had been murdered. That word got out very quickly among the Allies, and throughout the Battle of the Bulge, Malmedy would be invoked by soldiers many times as they were confronting and fighting the Germans. Hitler's initial assault, certainly you'd have to say it worked. There was, again, tremendous early advance, and it didn't help that we were trying to fight back in conditions like this in the snow. By the way, the Bulge is, the military term would be a salient. Salient. And this bulge is about 50 miles. You're wanting it 50 miles salient from here to here in Allied lines. The German tanks were well dug in, camouflaged in many cases. This is a German tank in the Ardennes in the Hürtgen forest. This photograph was taken December 17th. So 2 days into the Battle of the Bulge. An American officer reported in the daytime, they, meaning the German tanks, are relatively quiet or comparatively quiet. But at dawn, dusk, and the intervals during the night, they become active. They continually move around and shoot just enough to keep our troops in an almost frantic state of mind. American tanks, and here is American tanks, and you can see one is off the road. Again, a constant problem was the weather, the slippery roads, the rocks. Another constant problem were landmines. The Germans planted, some estimates are up to 10,000 landmines throughout the forest and throughout the Ardennes region. And very difficult for tanks, especially if they drove at night. They were constantly, tragically running into landmines. As a result, because they were so vulnerable at night, American tanks, and these are what they would call light tanks, usually move with a squad of infantry, usually right behind them. And they also moved with mine removal squads that provided by the engineers, Paul, to look for landmines before they were struck. One tank commander, an American tank commander, recalled, one time we didn't get out of the tanks for 4 days. Heavy artillery, 88s, mortars, screaming Mimes, those were from German rocket launchers, pounding and all around us. You got out of your tank to take a leak and you were a dead duck. Now, why is another shot from about the same time, December, you can again see the long line of American troops. Why was Bastogne so important? It was very strategic. There were 7 roughly all-weather roads, but 7 roads that all converged on Bastogne. So if you're moving, strategically, Bastogne needs to be defended. And also, Hitler is obsessed with taking Bastogne. And it is defended by the 101st Airborne. We talked about before, D-Day, 101st Airborne was ordered to defend Bastogne at all costs. The Germans surrounded Bastogne. At one point, there were German forces on all sides of Bastogne. And on December 22nd, 1944, now the battle's been going on for a week. The Germans sent a messenger and they demanded that American forces, 101st Airborne at Bastogne, surrender, which leads to one of the most memorable lines, I guess, to come out of World War II. This is General Anthony McAuliffe, McAuliffe, commander of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. He was given the letter demanding American surrender, and he sent back a reply with the courier.
What? Nuts.
That's right, as Paul says, his reply in its entirety was nuts. In fact, when the Germans received it, the story goes that one of the German officers looked at another and said, "What does that mean?" Nuts. What does that mean? And they had to talk among themselves, and before someone volunteered that meant forget it. No way in hell. McAuliffe also knew that Patton's Third Army was driving up north, actually at amazing speed, to try to relieve Bastogne. But let's not sugarcoat this. When he sent back his reply of nuts to the Germans, the 101st Airborne at Bastogne was in a very serious situation. During this point in time, by the way, General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, saw an opportunity which he acted on. If Hitler had thrown everything into Belgium, into the Ardennes, if he'd thrown everything in Luxembourg, he said to his senior commanders, who is defending the German army's rear? There's an opportunity. On Christmas Day, 1944, the German advance was halted. They got within 30 miles of Bastogne, not far, 30 miles of Bastogne. Some German soldiers actually got into Bastogne, but not many. But there was hand-to-hand combat. It was grueling. This is a great picture. The American and British soldiers nicknamed themselves, and Canadian, by the way, nicknamed themselves the battered bastards of Bastogne. And as you see here, this was taken late December 1944. U.S. tanks broke through German lines. And these are this is Patton's Third Army, and linked up with the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. Again, we go back to the map now. At this stage, you can see the Germans will now have to retreat back toward the Siegfried Line from Bastogne. You see the American 1st and 9th have now pushed past Malmedy, site of the massacre of American POWs, towards St. Vith and toward Bastogne. The Meuse River over here. And again, the Third Army, Patton's Army, coming back to provide relief. Patton himself would write, he wrote in his diary almost every day, and we have it. And he himself thought while he's usually praised for how quickly he got his Third Army to Bastogne to provide relief, he himself thought it should have been faster. It's interesting to read his diary. He thought he had failed, that he should have been there a day or two earlier. I don't know how he was going to do that unless the tanks were going to fly, but Patton was never satisfied. He always thought he could do better. A rare lighter photograph taken on New Year's Day or New Year's Eve in Bastogne for Adolf on Happy New Year and the American soldiers. More seriously, this is in the days that followed. And again, as we come to the end of the year, the battle begins to end. There was one more counterattack, but it failed by the Germans. They were spent. And this is right around New Year's Day. This is Bastogne. look at the condition of the Bastogne. It had been nearly destroyed. This is Omar Bradley, again, commander of the 12th Army, Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower. And people always think this is Pat, and it's not. This is Luther Hodges of the 1st Army. But they're surveying the damage at Bastogne. A final accounting, because I know we're getting out of time. This, by the way, this is one of the more flat areas. This looks almost fake, but this is a photograph digging foxholes in the Ardennes, in the Hürtgen forest. Final accounting, we had the Battle of the Bulge occurred during one of the coldest winters that anybody could remember. Thousands of soldiers on both sides lost fingers and toes and noses to frostbite. Frostbite was a major problem during the Battle of the Bulge. It was so cold, so miserable. And the most valued, what was the piece of equipment, if you will, it was the most valued by American soldiers? Socks, a pair of dry socks. And typically, if you could, by the way, there was bartering going on as always, as socks went for more than cigarettes did, which is saying something. Soldiers typically wore and had an extra pair of socks in their helmet, because again, people were frostbite, trench foot, all that was taking tremendous toll. The fighting in all, the Battle of the Bulge lasts about 6 weeks. We lose 19,000 American soldiers. 19,000 American soldiers die. Another 60,000 Americans, and Americans only, not counting the British and the Canadians and the French, were wounded, POWs, or missing in action. And look at it one other way, throughout this 6 weeks of hell in the Battle of the Bulge, American fatalities averaged about 1,600 men per day. 1,600 men per day. This was the single greatest loss of life for U.S. forces in the Western theater. But by January 30th, 1945, the Allies had regained all the lost ground. The Bulge was gone. Critically important, Hitler's gamble had blown up in his face. He had lost 100,000 men that he could not replace, 100,000 soldiers. Nearly all of the German tanks were gone, destroyed, or seriously disabled. And of course, the Luftwaffe, which people think the Luftwaffe played no role in the Battle of the Bulge. It did. For example, there was some bombing of Bastogne, but by the end of the Battle of the Bulge, the German Luftwaffe essentially no longer existed. And most importantly, for all of this, there was no way for Nazi Germany to replace what they had lost. The heavy American bombing of Germany was taking its toll, and of course, supply depots, everything else, munitions, armament factories, aircraft factories were becoming increasingly incapacitated. I'll leave you, this is an evocative picture of American soldiers, Bastogne, late December, early January 1945. Which brings us, of course, to the Yalta Conference. So the whole point of this part of the lecture was simply point out that while events in the Pacific, events on the Eastern Front certainly had to influence the actions of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, we should not forget that the Battle of the Bulge was just ending when they met in the Crimea, February the 3rd, 1945, and was also very much on the minds of all three Allied leaders. Okay, there's more I could say. There's always more I could say, but we're out of time. So, Pat, can we stop and take one? Thank you all very much. I wanted to, in particular, thank what's her name, Pat Spurlock, for her excellent presentation.
I think you got it.
And can we open it up to questions? You may now, okay, are you unmuting them or do they need to unmute themselves? Okay.
%. Oh, I thought.
Go Tigers.
Okay, you can all unmute yourselves, should be able to.
You can unmute yourselves, producer says, and how about some questions? How about some comments, criticisms?
Hey, this is Ryan.
Hi.
Where was the Hyrcan Forest in relation to the Battle of the Bulge? Was it like north of there or south of there?
It was in the Ardennes region. The map I showed earlier, Belgium, and actually it's the Ardennes is in Belgium, and also it's a little bit over the border into Luxembourg. In there was the Ardennes Forest. You'll see the terms used interchangeably, by the way. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, the Hyrcan Forest, and the Battle of the Bulge. We're talking about the same region.
This is Pat. You can all start your video also if you would like.
Okay. You hear that?
Yeah.
Let me also, I always am pushing books. One I just finished, Anthony Beever's Ardennes, see, interchangeable with Ardennes or Hyrcan Forest, The Battle of the Bulge, excellent international bestseller, excellent book. This is a very well-known, highly regarded military historian who's won many awards. And in fact, if you look at the cover, I showed you that very picture. So Ardennes, The Battle of the Bulge, Anthony Beever, Beevor. Yes. Question. I see a couple of clubbers. Questions?
This is Tom Harnett. I have a question.
Hi, Tom.
You had mentioned earlier that that Hitler wanted to start the battle November 1st, but it didn't actually get started until December 15th.
Right.
Would it, if they'd started November 1st, would that have made a difference? Were the conditions really poor that whole point, November 1st to December 15th?
It might have made a difference in terms of weather. The weather wasn't great, but it got worse during that period of time. So it might have made a difference in terms of weather. And of course, the weather cuts both ways, but I think Hitler's assessment, unfortunately, was correct that its primary impact was it limited our huge advantage in air power. You know, it was hard to bomb or hard to do reconnaissance from the air with that kind of in those kind of constant snowstorms that were occurring. So it might have made a difference there. Something I didn't mention, but I think is very interesting, is General Bradley, Omar Bradley, the 12th Army, and you saw where they were kind of the responsibility in the middle between up in the north, you had Monty, and in the south, you had Patton. Montgomery was given a lot of criticism, especially in the British press, but also some in the American press, for not having the line more strongly defended. I mentioned how it was lightly defended when the attack did come on December 15th. There'd be lots of second guessing of Bradley, whether or not he should have had stronger forces at the line before the, and of course the attack was a surprise, but we always knew it was a possibility. We didn't think it was going to happen, but it was a possibility. Bradley took that very personally. Bradley did not like being criticized and having it suggested that he had not done enough to have the line strongly defended. Understandable, who would like that? But the person who was most vocal, including to the press, that he thought Bradley had blundered, really, had made a mistake, was our good friend, Bernard Montgomery. Monty was very outspoken. He was outspoken to Eisenhower about it. He was outspoken to Churchill about it. Of course, it got back to Marshall and Roosevelt, to Marshall directly. That he thought that Omar Bradley had screwed up.
Wow.
And that led to great antipathy between the men. And there came a point, and I'll make this short, but there came a point where Ike was considering temporarily, in fact, he did do it temporarily, for purposes of coordination, placing Bradley's army under, which would be the 12th, under Montgomery's army for a few days. And there was an explosion. Ike didn't do it. He backed off after a couple of days. He didn't do it because he discovered that there was no American military commander who would serve under Montgomery. That's how hard the feelings were. And by the way, someone who knew that was Winston Churchill, who went out of his way to both FDR, to Marshall, and to Bradley directly to say, no, he's not speaking for the British government.
Why they always give Patton such a hard time? Because he always stood up.
Why they gave Patton a hard time? Well, he was
I know,
he was a pretty plain-spoken individual.
Exactly.
And he made his views known forcefully, and of course sometimes he was his own worst enemy, and when he was slapping the soldier and all that.
Right,
but nobody can take away what he did, especially I think the Battle of the Bulge. He moving as rapidly as he moved that Third Army was pretty impressive. Ike, who didn't always love Patton, was very impressed. And in fact, if you look at that last map, and I can't go back to it now, but when you see the final push into Germany, it's not being led by Montgomery, which is what he expected to happen. It's being led by Bradley and Patton.
Right.
And that was on purpose. Ike wanted to teach Montgomery a lesson. Later in life, I always think Ike had to be one of the most patient people in the world. When you think of the prima donnas, he had to herding cats. Only they could bite. And late in his life, he was asked what was the most difficult feature of being Supreme Allied Commander. And he said, the most difficult feature of being Supreme Allied Commander was Bernard Montgomery.
Yeah.
And he actually, I said, you know, this is Ike in retirement in the early 1960s. He said, you know, the man was a psychopath.
Wow.
Oh.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, it was. Now he didn't say that during the war because he had, you know, he had to manage Montgomery, but he in retirement, he said the man was a psychopath, and he says, and his ego always got in his way.
Wow.
Which it did.
Jim, this is Bill Walsh.
Hi, Bill.
Hi. As I understand, one of the reasons Montgomery was so difficult, his focus was entirely, I think, on the Ruhr. He wanted to march to the Ruhr instead.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah,
and he I don't think he ever gave up on that philosophy. So,
he went to his grave in 1958 maintaining that that was the right strategy and that Ike was wrong. You're exactly right. He also thought that he should be named Supreme Allied Commander.
Oh, yeah.
So, but and that his strategy would have been different. It you know, it got so, but you're right. That's exactly the Ruhr. That's exactly what he wanted to do. Churchill, to give you an example of how severe it got, give me one moment here. Well, I'll just tell you, I'm not finding it. Churchill actually got up in the House of Commons, and I just wish I could find it. It was wonderful. He got up in the House of Commons. Oh, here it is. This is January the 18th, 1945. The Prime Minister in the House of Commons emphasized that the United States, quote, the United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. Care must be taken in telling our proud tale, not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever famous American victory, which is a very eloquent, gracious way of saying, Monty, shut up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think for Churchill to do that in the House of Commons, pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Monty, of course, had already been giving press conferences saying basically they won the Battle of the Bulge because of me, which wasn't true. And we could have won it faster if we'd followed my plan.
Hindsight's always 2020.
Yeah, always 2020. The other person, by the way, who was a pain in the butt, Eisenhower, during the Battle of the Bulge was de Gaulle. What a surprise. Charles de Gaulle, who now been recognized as head of government of France, came to see Eisenhower, and he was up in arms because he wanted more autonomy for the French forces who were fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. He wanted them directly under his command, and he didn't like them reporting to in this case Hodges. And Churchill had Ike managed to smooth it over, but Churchill had a great line. He said after the meeting with Eisenhower and after they had calmed de Gaulle down, and again, much like with Montgomery, Ike finally said to de Gaulle, you want to kick this upstairs? We can go back to Churchill and Roosevelt. They can decide who's running this war, me or you, same as he had done with Montgomery. And after he left, Churchill wrote him and said, you know, I can never get over that offended look that de Gaulle takes when you're not telling him what he wants to hear. And he said, he reminds me of a llama who's startled in the bath. I mean, the man had a way with words. A llama who is startled in the back. Other questions, comments? Wasn't Pat good?
It's fantastic.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
she was. Pat, you're fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just think, you know, we use the example of my uncle, and of course I never got to know him because he died 6 years before I was born, but we used him, and I bet we could have used somebody from every member of the history.
Absolutely.
We all have. I was just talking to Jim Pancratz the other day about his uncle who died in World War II. And it's, I think all of us have stories of family members, and it always kills me, no pun not intended. It always kills me when you hear these stories about our family members who didn't come back, and then, oh, by the way, they were 19, or they were 20, or they were 25. They're always so young.
Jim, those reports, they were written after every encounter that the forces had?
It is amazing. They were called after action reports, and they were meant to be written daily.
Right.
In combat daily. And it's amazing. I mean, sometimes they weren't, but very rarely, they mostly were. And it's like Pat said, think of MASH. It's like radar writing up the report diligently, putting it in front of his company commander, whoever was in command, and saying, you know, sign this.
And who usually wrote them?
And then they would send them in.
Who usually wrote them?
Yeah, that was my question.
Well, it depended. Some, if they could, let's say it was a company, if he could, the company commander wrote them himself. If not, he would delegate it to someone who reported to him. So it varied. There was no firm rule, although the commander of the unit, be it a platoon, a company, right up to divisional commanders, so forth, they all had to sign them to vouch for their accuracy. And it's true with so many people, as we found with Danny, that you actually can find, this is poignant, but you can find on the map where he must have been when he was killed.
Amazing.
It is amazing.
I've recently read a book by Martha McCallum called Uncommon Valor, in which she traces an uncle she never met who died in the Pacific. And she explained in a podcast how she had followed the same trail that Pat did in uncovering what happened to Danny. And it was very interesting what she did. She took her uncle, 3 of his school friends, and then had a timeline of what was going on in the Western and the Pacific theater. So it was very similar to what unfolded today with Pat. Yeah.
You're just like me. I love listening to the podcasts.
Yeah.
And Martha McCallum, very good.
She's wonderful. Yeah,
She
she's wonderful.
really is wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent presentation again.
It was.
Oh, thanks. I owe it all to you and to Paul, and today our guest speaker, who got, I haven't paid her for her presentation. Maybe I'll buy her dinner or something.
I don't think you're gonna afford to pay.
Okay, maybe I'll take her out for some margaritas or something.
You all know nothing is free.
Nothing is free. You may have noticed I was pretty hard on Courtney Hodges. I looked at several different historians. The general view seems to be that he wasn't a very good commander during the Battle of the Bulge. He really didn't like. He was pretty inflexible. He wasn't very innovative, and he especially did not like people to say, maybe we ought to do something else. And many people feel that going straight into the Argonne, straight into the Hyrcan forest, instead of going further south, was really a mistake. So I seem to be a little tough on him. It seems to be the general consensus.
I'm sure the soldiers would agree with you.
Yeah, the soldiers, I think, would have agreed. Yeah, that's what his divisional commanders thought, that they were taking more casualties than they need to take if they had gone further south. I mean, it really was brutal, as I think some of the numbers I gave you point out. But somehow these young men, like the young man from Chicago who didn't even graduate from high school when he enlisted. Never, I think Pat said, Danny probably never held a rifle before he was in the service. And I said, well, he was from Chicago, so he might have held a gun. but my mother, who was, I guess, the next oldest sibling to Danny, his sister. My mother told me that he wanted to be a comedian. That he was very funny and was kind of if not the class clown, pretty close to it, and that he was really very funny, and that he, as a kid, was constantly listening to Bob Hope and Jack Benny and Burns and Allen. And at least as a teenager, that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a comedian.
Yeah.
And instead he became a soldier.
Is the cemetery where he is that considered in a safe area of Chicago at this point?
Well, it was for Pat. People don't usually mess with her. But I was born there. I was born in South Chicago.
Yeah, it's a very well-maintained cemetery in South.
And while it's a poor neighborhood, I'd say lower income. I think you said maybe lower income, middle class.
Well, that's where you lived.
Okay, but you were very impressed how nicely maintained the cemetery was.
Oh yeah, no, it's a. I don't know if it's considered a national cemetery or not, but it's very nice. It was.
Most of it was.
Shall I tell them what Pat said when she finally found his cemetery? Pat had brought along scissors and a brush, and she cleaned up her headstone. Have I told the story?
No.
She cleaned up the headstone. She trimmed, the growth, because no one who ever knew him was still living.
Sure.
Except for my brother, and he was and is in California. So no one had been to that cemetery and to see him in many, many years. They were all dead. And so Pat cleaned it up, trimmed it up, and she said, borrowed a flag from a veteran on a nearby grave, which she then returned, but she did borrow the American flag to take the picture. And she looked at this, when she had it all tidied up, she looked at the grave and said, Danny, you're probably wondering who the hell I am.
Oh, that's great.
But you had a nephew you never knew, and I'm his wife.
Wow.
That's true.
My grandmother, again, we all have these stories. My grandmother Elsie, who lived with us all the time I was growing up, she was like a second mother to me. Lived to be into her 90s. Wow. Wonderful woman, and that was the one thing you had to be very careful of talking about was Danny. And what happens every year, St. Patrick's Day, and you know, I remember distinctly. You'd have parents would have on Lawrence Welk or something, and or Jack Benny and Dennis Day would sing Danny Boy, and whenever she heard that come on, she always would just get up and leave the room because she couldn't
handle that. Yeah,
I always thought that was very touching.
Absolutely.
But again, we all have those stories. Who else had a comment, suggestion, anything? No. We had one little glitch today, but I got through it.
I had one comment that on your map, I was really surprised that we being Americans, were in charge. I never realized it. The only other ones was Britain for a little bit.
In charge at the Battle of the Bulge. Yeah. You look at those commanders.
Sure.
And they're American, British, but mainly American. Canadians played an important role. There's one commander I didn't mention down southern portion of Argonne that was an army commander, army group commander, Canadian, but the rest were all Americans. And again, we had some Free French who fought. I think we also had some Australians who fought in the Battle of the Bulge. But it was primarily, as Churchill said, it was primarily an American show.
Sure.
Yes, Pat wants to make a. Oh, can you all see that?
Oh, look at that.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. South Chicago. Pat found it. That's the stolen flag that she returned.
Wow.
Yeah. That's she sent that picture to me. We were then living in Alexandria, Virginia, and Pat sent the picture to me on my phone. And as it would so happen, I happened to be sitting in a bar in Old Town Alexandria. It was a long bar. It was Joe Theismann's restaurant. It was very popular. Long line of people. And it was, like 7, 8 o'clock in the evening. And so I showed it to the guy next to me because he was a veteran. And he proceeded to pass it down the bar. So 20 people at the bar saw it, and then they got versions of the story passed to and from. And it was very interesting.
I bet.
In fact, the veteran sitting next to me, he was a retired Marine, and he said, "You mean she went there and somebody she never met and found his grave and blah blah, did all that?" I said, "Yeah." And I said, we don't forget.
Yeah.
We should never forget it. And he actually, the retired Marine, he actually got tears in his eyes.
Yeah.
And he said something like, "Damn, that's how it should be."
Absolutely.
All right. If we should we wrap it up? more questions and we'll wrap it up. If not, thank you all very much.
Well,
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks,
Jim.
And thank you for all the patience with
Thank
all right.
I think
Here's Richie.
we're doing pretty well with this.
Why is this still
I
going
think
on?
so.
I've noticed, Pat and I have noticed the number of people when we send out the emails to Zoom who are now going on. He's watching.
I was talking to Margaret Miller.
What is that?
She
People who are
started-
going on throughout the month is
She
gone
says
up.
it's unbelievable how they can't. She says people are just.
All right. Well, thank you all. Have a safe month.
Thank you, and thank Pat.
And
Be well. Be well.
be well.
Bye.
Most of all, be well.
Be well.
See you
See you
next
next month.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
month. Bye.